My name is John Dawson, and I'm doing a series of videos on how to do Pronto prints. This particular video deals with the actual printing of the Pronto plate. Printing Pronto plates has one great advantage over traditional lithography, and that is that you don't really have to do anything special to the plate. You don't have to counter etch it, you don't have to etch it, you don't have to put asphaltum on it. You just need to put your image on the plate and then print it. Having said that, it's not really all that easy. In doing a video about printing, it really requires a lot of trial and error. There are just too many variables. The kind of press that you are going to be using, the kind of paper that you use, the kind of ink you're going to use, are all variables that require a certain amount of trial and error. Even adjusting the pressure on the press will require a certain amount of trial and error for anyone doing Pronto prints to get it exactly right. As I've mentioned probably in previous videos, nearly all of my experience is with the etching process. And so I'll be doing the printing on an etching press. I'm sure that these could also be done on a litho press, but I really don't know anything about doing prints on a litho press. So all the things that I'll be talking about will pertain to printing on an etching press. So I'll be going through all the various materials that you'll probably need in order to do a successful print. Okay, here are most of the things that you'll need to print your plate. First, you're going to need some sponges. You're going to need at least two. You're going to need two bowls. Metal bowls work the best. The ink doesn't stick to them. Plastic bowls, the ink tends to stick to them and they get really dirty and grungy pretty quickly. You're going to need some gum arabic. You're going to need a putty knife to mix the ink with. And then, of course, you're going to need some ink. This is Graphic Chemical Litho ink number 1796, and it was recommended. However, I believe pretty much any litho ink or etching ink will also work. I use some surgical gloves. The water that you use to sponge down the plates and the sponges can get pretty grungy and dirty and get your hands pretty messy. And this solves that problem. Of course, it's totally up to you whether you want to use them or not. You may need some magnesium carbonate. This is used to stiffen up the ink if it's too loose. Magnesium carbonate is a very fine white powder, and it really works best if you have it in a shaker. This is Sitwell, and it's the opposite thing. If the ink is too stiff, and if you're going to use etching ink, sometimes it's pretty stiff, and you would use this to loosen up the ink. And then, believe it or not, you're going to need some toothpaste and plain white fluoride, and I guess the fluoride part of it is important. Plain white fluoride toothpaste I think works the best, and we'll demonstrate how to use that in a little while. Then you're going to need either a brayer or a roller, depending on how large a plate you're going to print. The brayer, of course, for smaller plate, a large roller for larger plate. And then you're going to need some newsprint and some print paper. Now, the print paper I like is Reeves PFK, but there's a lot of good print paper out there, and almost any of them I'm sure would be sufficient. Then the last thing you're going to need is something to roll the ink up on, and I use a glass palette. And for anyone who's interested, I have a video out on YouTube on how to make a glass palette. However, if you're just wanting to do this on a temporary basis, you could tape down a piece of glass to a piece of masonite or a table, and it would probably suffice on a temporary basis. So that's just about everything you need to have to print your Pronto plate, and we'll get started on those right away. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be printing on a etching press. And I have kind of a limited space for my press, so I don't ink the plate on the press. And what I've done is I've gotten a sheet of plexiglass, which I've beveled around the edge. You don't absolutely have to bevel it for this process. I think it's much better if you do, safer for the press. Then I've gotten an aluminum litho sheet, litho plate, and I'm going to tape that down to the plexiglass, and then I'll be putting the Pronto plate on the aluminum plate to ink it. As I said, we'll need 2 bowls, and as I also mentioned, it's preferable if they're metal bowls. The first one we're going to mix what's called a fountain solution, and that's what we'll be using the toothpaste for, and I'll be showing you how to do that in a minute. The fountain solution is to remove the scumming, or in some cases, if you get a dry roll on the plate, it helps remove the ink from that dry roll. The second bowl is for the solution that you're going to use to sponge the plate up. And we're going to show you how to mix that here in a second also. The recommended solution for sponging down your plate is about a quart of water, about a half a teaspoon of citric acid, and about an ounce of gum arabic. I don't do exact measurements on this. I don't think it's really necessary. This is intended to help prevent scumming when you're inking up your plate. Gum arabic is pretty common. You will probably need that if you're going to do much in terms of Pronto printing or pretty much any other kind of printing. But the citric acid it's hard to come by. I just happen to have it on hand, so I'm using it. I doubt if it's really all that necessary, and I certainly wouldn't have bought it just for this. The fountain solution that I'm making here is very useful for getting rid of unwanted marks if you happen to get fingerprints on the plate that you didn't see, or if you make a mistake and get marks from the roller or ink on the plate that you don't want. This is simply made by taking about 2 inches of toothpaste to about a quart of water. It's easier to dissolve the toothpaste if you put just a little water in it first, and then dissolve the toothpaste and then add more water later. If you have a spot on the plate that you're anxious to get rid of and looks like it's going to be harder than just sponging it off with the fountain solution, you can put a little toothpaste on a sponge and apply it directly to the plate, and as you can see, it comes right off. Now about the paper. You're going to need a lot of newsprint. If you have full sheets of newsprint, I would tear them down so that they're a little larger than the plate. They don't have to be the exact same size as the plate. There's no use to using full sheets of newsprint and wasting a lot of newsprint. The purpose of the newsprint is to print the first printings through the press to bring the plate up to its full inked position. And that can take quite a few passes through the press. Sometimes it's only 2 or 3, and sometimes it's 4 or 5 or 6 times before the plate is fully inked. And then what I like to do is take a piece of inexpensive paper that I've cut to the size of the plate and run it through the press to make sure that the plate is fully inked before I start to use expensive paper. Now the biggest mistake that I made when I first did Pronto plates was I was too anxious to see the print come up. So I had a tendency to over ink the plate in order to get it to come up faster. You have to be patient and run the newsprint through the press time after time after time until it's fully inked. If you over ink the plate, it creates all sorts of problems. The biggest one is that you are likely to lose all the delicate areas on the plate, or as you can see from this one, which is one of the first ones that I printed, I way over inked the plate, and you can see that the head turned into just a big smear. If you over ink the plate, it's not that easy to get it back into its original form. You pretty much have to just keep running it through the press with newsprint until you have all the ink off of it. And then you might go over it with a fountain solution to try to get the ink out of the areas that it doesn't belong in. Then the plate has to have at least a 1-inch border around the edge of the plate. It obviously can be more than 1 inch, but it has to be at least 1 inch. Then you will have to cut the paper. You're going to cut as many pieces of paper as you think you're going to print. If you're going to do an edition of 10, then you'd want to cut at least 10, probably more than 10, because it's very unlikely that every single print will come out exactly as you'd want it to. You're going to cut the paper. I like to cut the paper exactly the same size of the plate. It makes it much easier to place the paper on the plate. You don't want the paper to be larger than the plate. It doesn't print well if the paper is larger than the plate. So that's pretty much what you need to do as far as preparing the paper. I'm using graphic chemical litho ink, and I think this ink is a little too loose, so I'm adding some magnesium carbonate in order to stiffen the ink up a little bit. Once I have that mixed in, I'm going to spread out a line of ink on the glass palette, and then I'll begin to roll it up on the roller. When you roll it up on the roller, it should look kind of velvety. If it begins to look tacky or sticky, then you've probably got too much ink in the roller, and a way to solve that is to go to a bare spot on the glass palette and roll out the ink again, getting a lot of the ink off the roller. It seems that what a lot of printers do to keep the plate in place is to put gum arabic underneath the plate. I really don't like that method, so I take a little piece of Scotch tape, put it into a loop so it's sticky all the way around, and then put it in about 3 places under the plate at the border. After about 7 or 8 printings, some of the tape may need to be replaced. It's also going to show a slight embossed area on the border when it's printed. However, for me, I think this works better, especially if you need to keep the plate in an exact position for registration purposes. And it prevents the plate from rolling up onto the roller. Well, next, of course, is the sponging down of the plate. I put some water underneath the plate. It also helps to keep it in place. Then you sponge down the plate. You don't want it to be really wet and puddly. It's just got to be slightly damp. It's one of those things that you really can only really get through a certain amount of experience. Next is rolling the ink onto the plate. You want to run the roller over the plate 3 or 4 times without picking it up. That seems to really help load the ink onto the plate. And I take a paper towel and wipe off all the excess water. Next you put the plate on the press, then put the print paper over the top of the plate. Next I put a sheet of newsprint, then a sheet of Mylar, a piece of mat board, and finally a very thin etching blanket. The newsprint is going to get wet and sop up a lot of the water, and after a while you want to change it, but don't throw the newsprint away. It's going to turn out to be useful later on. And now it's a matter of running it through the press and onto the finished print. Supposedly, one of the advantages to printing Pronto plates is that you are supposed to be able to print them without the use of a press. And I'm not so sure I really believe that, so I'm going to give it a try. As I said earlier, to get any of the Pronto plates to print properly, you need to do a number of proof sheets first, inking the plate up to a place where it's fully inked. So I fudged on this a little bit. I put it through the press with the newsprint until I got it up to the place where it was in a printable state. And now I'm going to put the paper on and run it over first with a roller and then a spoon. I tried this once before with just the roller and it worked, but it didn't work too well. Now we're going to use a spoon and see if that doesn't do a better job. And it actually came out with a pretty nice print. And I think an old-fashioned rolling pin would probably work real well for this technique. I doubt if you could do anything very large, or at least it would probably be very difficult to do anything very large. But I was kind of surprised that it did work. Well, the last thing is the cleanup. Hopefully you've saved some of these sheets of newsprint that you were using earlier in the printing process rather than wasting them. You take a full sheet, fold it in half. You're going to put it over the top of your plate and put another discarded piece of newsprint over the top of that and run it through the press. Then you take it, the second one, turn it over, run it through the press again. Then you can take the same sheet, fold it the other way, put it on top of the plate with another sheet of newsprint in order to keep anything that's on the printed newsprint from printing on anything else, and run it through the press again. You want to do this about 5 or 6 times to try and get most of the ink or nearly all the ink off the plate. Then some people like to wash the plate down, and the simplest thing to use really is the fountain solution you made earlier with the toothpaste. You just wipe the fountain solution over the plate and wash it down and let it dry or fan it dry. And then I usually put it in a folded piece of newsprint again, and then store it in a portfolio or a print drawer. So that just about does it for this one. I'm going to follow this up with some examples of my own work and the web address for my website and Facebook page. And if you're interested, you can subscribe to other videos of mine on YouTube.